The restaurant was buzzing with the soft clatter of silverware and the quiet hum of conversations. It was an expensive place, the kind where only the wealthy dined, where a single meal cost more than what some people made in a week. At the center of it all sat a young woman, elegantly dressed in a designer outfit, her nails perfectly manicured, her diamond earrings catching the light. She scrolled through her phone, looking bored. Nothing impressed her. The food, the people, the atmosphere, everything was beneath her. That was when he walked in. A homeless man, his clothes tattered, his face lined with exhaustion, his hands trembling slightly. He stepped in hesitantly, his eyes darting around, expecting to be thrown out. Instead, he approached a waitress and, in a polite but weary voice, asked, "Excuse me, would you mind if I had some of the leftover food? I'm really hungry." The restaurant fell silent. The young woman looked up from her phone, her perfectly shaped eyebrows rising. Then, in an exaggerated voice, she laughed. The sound was sharp, cutting through the silence like a knife. She turned to the people around her. "Did you hear that? He wants our leftovers." A few guests chuckled uncomfortably, while others avoided looking at the man altogether. The waitress hesitated, unsure what to do. The woman wasn't done. She leaned forward, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "You're in the wrong place, sweetheart. This isn't a charity. Maybe try a garbage can instead?" The homeless man's face didn't change. He simply nodded, murmured a quiet, "I understand," and turned to leave. But before he could step outside, someone else spoke. "Miss," a calm yet firm voice said. The woman turned, irritated at the interruption. A man in a dark suit sat near the corner, watching everything unfold. He hadn't spoken a word the entire evening, until now. He stood up slowly, adjusting his cuffs, his eyes locked onto hers. A chilling smile crossed his face. "I hope you enjoyed your meal," he said. Something about his tone made the woman pause. She rolled her eyes. "And why do you care?" The man pulled a small, sleek black device from his pocket and pressed a button. A holographic screen flickered to life in front of him. A robotic voice spoke. "Identity verified. Warning issued for Elite Citizen 276B." The woman frowned. "What? What does that mean?" The restaurant staff exchanged uneasy glances. The waitress smirked. The homeless man, now standing near the door, gave a knowing smile before stepping out into the night. The woman had no idea. Her life was about to change forever. The young woman sat frozen, her mind racing. The words, "identity verified. Warning issued," echoed in her head. "What kind of joke is this?" she scoffed, looking around for validation. But nobody laughed. Instead, the restaurant staff exchanged uneasy glances, and the once silent customers murmured among themselves. The man in the dark suit stepped forward, his expression unreadable. He held up the black device again. "Initiating status update." The holographic screen flickered again, and suddenly, her phone went dark. Confused, she tapped the screen, but it was unresponsive. A sinking feeling twisted in her stomach. She checked her smartwatch, offline. Then, her banking app popped open by itself. Her breath caught in her throat. Balance, $0. She blinked, heart pounding. She refreshed the screen. Nothing. Her credit cards, her savings, her investments, all wiped clean. "What is this?" she snapped, standing up so fast her chair scraped against the floor. "Fix this right now." The suited man simply tilted his head. "Why should I?" She opened her mouth to argue, but then, her expensive designer dress glitched. The shimmering fabric rippled, then vanished, replaced by a plain, gray outfit. The kind worn by service workers. Gasps echoed around the room. No, 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 she screamed, frantically tugging at the fabric as if she could bring back her lost wealth with sheer force. She turned to the waitress, the very same one she had mocked minutes ago. Do something. The waitress crossed her arms, smirking. I'd be careful if I were you. The restaurant manager approached, his face now cold, professional. Ma'am, I'm going to have to ask you to leave. The young woman's face twisted in shock. I'm a loyal customer here. You can't. I'm afraid you no longer have an account with us, the manager interrupted smoothly. He gestured toward the door. Reality started closing in. She wasn't dreaming. This wasn't a prank. This was real. Miss, the suited man said again, stepping closer. He leaned in slightly, his voice calm but firm. You are no longer who you think you are. Then, the distant sound of sirens filled the air. The woman's eyes widened. She looked outside. A group of security officers dressed in black were heading straight for the restaurant. Her legs turned to lead. What? What's happening? She whispered, fear creeping into her voice. The suited man gave her a small, knowing smile. Lesson 1, the world can change in an instant. Her world had just collapsed, and she had no idea how much worse it was about to get. The young woman stood in shock, her heartbeat pounding in her ears as the security officers entered the restaurant. Is there a problem here? One of them asked, his deep voice cutting through the tension. The suited man turned to them and nodded slightly. Identity status has been revoked. She is no longer an elite citizen. The officers' expressions didn't change, but they immediately turned toward her. What? No, she gasped, backing away. I didn't do anything. This is some kind of mistake. One of the officers held up a small scanner and waved it in front of her face. The device blinked red. Status, revoked. No assets. No privileges. No identification. The young woman felt her knees weaken. Her hands trembled as she reached for her phone again. Maybe she could call someone, her father, her friends, someone had to fix this. But the phone was still dead. She turned to the restaurant staff, to the people she had been dining beside just minutes ago. Someone, help me. I don't know what's happening. Silence. Some looked away, suddenly uninterested. Others whispered to each other. A few smirked. The same waitress she had mocked now approached with a tray. But instead of food, it held a bill. Before you go, the waitress said sweetly, you'll need to settle this. The woman grabbed the paper, eyes widening at the amount. It was hundreds of dollars. I don't have my cards, she stammered. They're gone. Not our problem, the manager said, crossing his arms. You ate. You pay. The security officers exchanged a glance. Since she has no means of payment, one of them said, we will escort her outside. The woman let out a nervous laugh, trying to regain control. Wait. I know people. I have connections. I can fix this. Just let me. One of the officers grabbed her arm. She yanked away in horror. Don't touch me. I'm not a criminal. No, the suited man said, his eyes cold. But you are now just like the people you used to look down on. The words hit her harder than she expected. Let's go, the officer said, guiding her toward the exit. The young woman stumbled into the cold night air. She spun around, expecting the suited man to follow. But the restaurant doors shut behind her. She turned back to the street. The city was still the same, but suddenly, it felt harsher. Her luxury car was gone. Her driver was nowhere to be seen. She reached for her smartwatch to call a ride, but it was locked out. Everything she owned, everything she relied on, had disappeared. She stood there, the cold wind biting through her thin uniform, her breath coming fast. A limousine pulled up in front of the restaurant. The tinted window rolled down. The homeless man from earlier sat inside, his face calm, his eyes filled with quiet amusement. "Your turn to learn," he said, then the car drove off into the night. The young woman stood frozen. For the first time in her life, she had nothing. And she had nowhere to go. The young woman stood on the sidewalk, hugging herself against the cold. The reality of what had just happened was sinking in like a heavy weight on her chest. Her luxury life was gone. Her money was gone. Her status was gone. She turned toward the restaurant again, but the doors were shut. The lights inside glowed warmly, people laughing and dining in comfort, a world she no longer belonged to. A car sped past, splashing dirty water onto her legs. She gasped, shivering as the wet fabric clung to her skin. Taking a deep breath, she pulled out her phone again, pressing the power button. Still nothing. No signal. No apps. No access. She swallowed hard. This isn't real. This can't be happening. Her hands trembled as she tried to think. What now? Where could she go? Her apartment. Yes. Maybe it wasn't too late. Maybe this was just a mistake, maybe everything would be fine once she got home. She hurried down the street, ignoring the strange looks people gave her. She had never walked this part of the city before. She had always been driven everywhere, in comfort, in style. Now, she was just another person walking in the cold. By the time she reached her apartment building, her feet ached. Her hair was a mess. Her confidence had cracked. She rushed toward the entrance, relieved to see the familiar sight of her home, until the security guard stepped in front of her. "Sorry, ma'am. You can't enter." She blinked. "What?" The guard's expression was firm. "Your access has been revoked." She let out a breathless laugh. "No, you don't understand, I live here." The guard checked his tablet. "Not anymore. Your lease was terminated an hour ago. The system says your belongings have been removed." Her stomach twisted. "Removed? Where?" The guard shrugged. "Probably in storage. Or auctioned." Her heart pounded. She tried to push past him, but he blocked her with one hand. "You need to leave," he said. Tears burned her eyes. "But where am I supposed to go?" The guard didn't answer. He simply turned away. For the first time in her life, she was truly homeless. Hours later, she wandered through the city, her arms wrapped around herself for warmth. She tried calling her friends, but none of them answered. She tried asking a stranger for help, but they avoided her gaze, walking faster. Her stomach growled. Hunger gnawed at her, sharp and cruel. For the first time ever, she had no money for food. Her legs felt weak. She sat down on a cold bench, staring at the people walking by. The same people she once mocked for dressing cheap, for walking instead of driving. Now, she was one of them. A street vendor nearby was serving hot soup. The smell made her stomach twist with longing. Swallowing her pride, she forced herself to stand up and walk over. The old woman behind the cart glanced at her. "You want some?" The young woman nodded quickly. "Yes, please." The old woman smiled. $5. She opened her mouth, but no words came out. She had nothing. She looked around, desperate. She could beg. No. The thought made her sick. She would never beg. Instead, she turned away, her stomach aching with hunger. The rain started falling. Cold. Unforgiving. For the first time in her life, she had no one to turn to. And for the first time in her life, she felt completely alone. The young woman sat on the damp bench, hugging herself as the cold rain soaked through her clothes. The city lights flickered around her, but they no longer felt warm or inviting. Instead, they reminded her of what she had lost. Her stomach growled again, a sharp pain twisting inside her. She hadn't eaten in almost a full day. Her fingers clenched into fists. This isn't happening. It had to be some sort of mistake. Some glitch in the system. Any second now, someone would call her, tell her it was all just a misunderstanding, bring her back to her old life. But no one did. No messages. No calls. Just the cold. Just the hunger. She wiped her face, swallowing her pride. I have to do something. She stood up, her legs weak, and started walking. She passed restaurants and cafes, the smell of food making her stomach tighten painfully. Her hands shook as she pulled open the door to a small diner. Inside, the warmth hit her immediately. The soft chatter of people, the sound of clinking plates, it all felt so familiar, yet so out of reach. She approached the counter hesitantly. The man behind it, an older cook with a grease-stained apron, raised an eyebrow. Help you? She licked her lips. This was it. I don't have any money, she whispered. But I haven't eaten. Maybe I could, I don't know, work for a meal. The cook stared at her for a moment. Then, he shook his head. No handouts here, he said, turning away. Her heart sank. She stepped back, bumping into a chair. A customer glanced up, then quickly looked away. No one cared. She walked out of the diner, the warmth fading as soon as she hit the street. Her hands clenched at her sides. She had mocked people like this before. She had sneered at beggars. She had refused to tip waiters if the service wasn't perfect. Now, she was the one being ignored. Her stomach clenched again. She needed to find food, anything. She turned a corner and spotted a grocery store. A worker had just brought out a cart of expired food, pushing it toward the dumpster. Her throat tightened. No. She wasn't that desperate. But then the worker dumped the food and walked away. Her legs moved on their own. She stepped toward the trash bin, glancing around. No one was watching. Her hands trembled as she reached inside. Then, a voice behind her. First time. She froze. Slowly, she turned. An old woman sat nearby, wrapped in layers of blankets, her gray hair tangled. Despite her rough appearance, her eyes were kind. The young woman didn't answer. She couldn't. The old woman smiled knowingly. Took me a while, too. Shame burned in the young woman's chest. She clenched her jaw, shoving her hands into her pockets instead. I don't need charity, she muttered, turning away. The old woman chuckled softly. You don't have a choice. The young woman stormed off, her hunger gnawing at her insides. The rain kept falling. The night felt endless. And for the first time, she truly understood what it meant to have nothing. The young woman sat on the edge of a crumbling sidewalk, rainwater pooling around her feet. Her body ached from exhaustion, her stomach twisted in hunger, and her mind screamed for a way out. But there was no way out. Not anymore. Her pride had kept her from begging, but now, even that was cracking. How long could she last like this? She looked around. The streets weren't empty, people walked past her, but not a single one made eye contact. She had done the same thing once. Avoided, ignored, dismissed. And now, she was invisible. Her fingers curled into her wet sleeves, her breath shaking. I can't do this. I can't live like this. She was about to stand up when a shadow loomed over her. She looked up, blinking through the rain. It was him. The man in the dark suit. The same man from the restaurant. He stood there, an umbrella shielding him from the rain, his face calm and unreadable. Her chest tightened. "Why are you here?" she whispered. The man tilted his head slightly. "Did you learn anything?" Her throat burned. "What is this?" she snapped. "Some kind of sick joke? You took everything from me. My money, my home, my entire life. And now you just show up?" The man exhaled, almost as if he had expected this reaction. "You think this happened to you?" he said softly. The young woman's eyes narrowed. "What does that mean?" He crouched slightly, leveling his gaze with hers. "This didn't happen to you. It happened because of you." She shook her head, rain dripping from her soaked hair. "I don't understand." A slight smirk touched the man's lips. He reached into his coat and pulled out a small black device, the same one from the restaurant. He pressed a button. A holographic screen flickered to life. The woman flinched. The same robotic voice from before spoke. "Status update, experiment complete." Her breath caught in her throat. "Experiment?" She stared at the screen, then back at the man. "What? What are you saying?" He stood up again, placing his hands in his pockets. This was a test. A chill that had nothing to do with the rain ran through her. "A test?" she echoed. The man nodded. "You were chosen for an experiment, to see what happens when a person who has everything is stripped of it all. To see if they would remain the same." Her mind spun. This couldn't be real. She had been watched. Her suffering, her struggle, it had all been planned. Her hands clenched into fists. "So you just let me starve," she hissed. "You just watched while I suffered?" The man's expression didn't change. "We didn't force you to do anything," he said. "You made the choices. You judged people. You ignored them. You mocked them." Her breath shook. "And what," she whispered, "would have happened if I had treated that homeless man differently?" The man's smirk grew slightly. "Then you would have never lost anything." She staggered back. Her mind replayed the moment, the way she had mocked the homeless man at the restaurant. The way she had laughed. And now. Her eyes burned. Her chest felt too tight. She had failed. The man sighed, stepping closer. "But that doesn't mean you can't change." Her lips parted slightly, her breath uneven. "Change?" He nodded. "This was the first half of the experiment. The real question is, now that you've lived this way, will you choose to be different?" Her stomach turned. She wanted to scream at him. To demand her life back. But something inside her whispered that she didn't deserve it. Not yet. She looked away, her jaw tight. The man watched her for a long moment, then slowly reached into his pocket. He pulled out a keycard. She frowned. "What's that?" "A second chance," he said simply. Her pulse spiked. He held it out to her. "But you have to earn it." The young woman stared at the keycard, her heart pounding. She could take it. She could go back. But deep down, she knew. If she went back now, nothing would change. She would still be the same person. And that wasn't what she wanted anymore. Slowly, her fingers curled away from the keycard. The man raised an eyebrow. "No?" She swallowed. Her voice came out barely above a whisper. "Not yet." A flicker of approval passed through the man's eyes. For the first time, she wasn't trying to escape this. She was trying to learn from it. And that was something worth more than any keycard. The keycard hovered in the man's hand, the rain drumming softly around them. The young woman stared at it, heart pounding. This was her way out. And yet, she didn't take it. She wasn't ready. For the first time in her life, she understood that going back without change meant nothing. The man in the dark suit studied her for a moment, then nodded approvingly. "Interesting choice," he said, slipping the keycard back into his pocket. The woman exhaled shakily. "So, what now?" The man glanced around. "Now, you live. Not as a privileged elite. Not as a victim. But as someone who understands what it means to struggle." Her fingers curled. "And if I don't?" His expression darkened slightly. Then this lesson meant nothing. A chill ran down her spine. That was the real test, wasn't it? Not just losing everything, but choosing what to do next. The man reached into his coat once more, this time pulling out a small, folded piece of paper. "Go here," he said, pressing it into her palm. "You'll figure out the rest." She hesitated before taking it, fingers brushing against the damp paper. By the time she looked up, he was gone. Just like that. The rain had slowed. The city was quiet. She unfolded the paper carefully. Community Center, 45th and Bayesti. Ask for Evelyn. Her brows furrowed. A community center? She could have ignored it. She could have torn the paper in half and walked away. But she didn't. Instead, she started walking. Hours later, a different world. By the time she reached the community center, the sun had started peeking through the clouds. The building was old but full of life. Inside, people bustled around, a mix of volunteers and those in need. The scent of warm food filled the air. She hesitated at the door. This wasn't her world. Not before. But it was now. Taking a deep breath, she stepped inside. A woman in her 60s, with kind eyes and silver hair pulled into a bun, approached her. "Can I help you, dear?" The young woman swallowed. I was told to ask for Evelyn." The older woman smiled. "That's me." She hesitated again. How did she even explain why she was here? But before she could speak, Evelyn nodded knowingly. "Come on, sweetheart. Let's get you something warm to eat first." The young woman's throat tightened. For the first time in days, someone wasn't pushing her away. And she wasn't too proud to accept help anymore. She followed Evelyn inside, the warmth of the place wrapping around her like something she hadn't felt in years. Weeks later, becoming someone new. She never left. What started as a desperate search for survival turned into something more. She cleaned tables. She helped serve meals. She listened to stories from people who had been struggling for years. People she had never noticed before. And slowly, she changed. She wasn't just trying to survive anymore. She was learning. Helping. Growing. And for the first time, she didn't feel empty. She felt alive. One evening, as she wiped down a counter, Evelyn approached her. "You know," she said, "when you first walked in here, I wasn't sure you'd last." The young woman let out a soft chuckle. "Honestly? Me neither." Evelyn smiled warmly. "But I've seen people come and go. And I can tell when someone's heart is changing." She hesitated, watching the volunteers around them. "Evelyn, do you think people like me really can change?" Evelyn's eyes twinkled. "My dear," she said, patting her hand, "I think you already have." The words hit deep. For the first time, she wasn't defined by what she had lost. She was defined by what she had become. Months passed. The young woman, no, she wasn't that person anymore, she was someone else now. She didn't wake up in silk sheets. She didn't have a team of people waiting to serve her. Instead, she woke up early, helped prepare food for those in need, and listened to people who had real struggles. And the strangest part? For the first time in her life, she felt happy. Not the fake happiness she had back then, the kind that came from expensive things and empty conversations. This happiness was real. She had purpose. She had connection. She had something money could never buy. One afternoon, a full-circle moment. She was stacking chairs when she heard a familiar voice. "I don't know how I got here," the voice mumbled. She turned. A young man, dressed in a wrinkled suit, his hair a mess, stood at the entrance. His shoes were scuffed, his hands twitching. He looked lost. She knew that look. Evelyn approached him, calm and warm as always. "Come in, dear. You're safe here." But the young woman didn't move. Because she knew who he was. He had been one of her old friends. One of the people she used to party with, dine with, laugh with. And now? He was exactly where she had been. Their eyes met. His widened. No. No way. He recognized her. She could see the confusion on his face. The disbelief. She used to be like him. And now she was the one helping. She stepped forward, her voice steady. "Come on," she said. "Let's get you something to eat." His lips parted. He looked around as if this was a joke. But there was no joke. No cameras. Just real people helping each other. Slowly, he followed her inside. And just like that, it all came full circle. That evening, the final test. As she wiped down the kitchen counters, she felt a presence behind her. She turned, and there he was. The man in the dark suit. She didn't even flinch this time. "You came back," she said simply. He gave a small nod. "I always do." She set down the rag. "So? Did I pass your test?" His lips curved slightly. "You tell me." She thought for a moment. She had lost everything. She had suffered. She had been humbled. And then? She had rebuilt herself. Not as the spoiled woman she used to be. But as someone who understood. She met his gaze. "I think I did," she said softly. He reached into his coat pocket. For a brief second, she thought he was going to pull out the keycard again. Instead, he pulled out a simple white envelope. She hesitated before taking it. Inside was a letter. It only had one sentence. "Your real test begins now." She looked up sharply. "What does that mean?" The man smiled. "You'll find out soon enough." And just like before, he was gone. The young woman stared at the letter, heart pounding. She had already changed. But something told her. This was only the beginning. A year later. The young woman, no, the woman she had become, stood in front of a grand building, her heart pounding. The same woman who once spent her days judging others, mocking the less fortunate, believing wealth made her better. Now, she stood among people who had truly changed her life. The community center had grown. More volunteers, more people helped, more second chances given. And tonight? She was being honored for it. Inside the grand hall, a moment she never expected. The hall was full of people. Some were wealthy elites, some were struggling to survive, and some, like her, had been both. At the front of the stage, a familiar figure stepped up to the microphone. The man in the dark suit. For the first time, she saw him not as a mystery, but as a guide. He looked out at the crowd, his deep voice calm and steady. "Many of you have asked why we do these experiments. Why we take those who have everything, and strip them of it all." A quiet murmur spread through the room. The woman listened, hanging on to every word. The answer is simple. Wealth is not measured in money. Power is not measured in control. True value is found in character. In kindness. In what you give when you think you have nothing left. The words hit deep. He turned toward her. Some people fail this test. They crumble, they break, they never recover. He paused. But some rise. A spotlight shifted. Onto her. Her breath caught in her throat. Tonight, we honor someone who proved that true wealth is not about what you own, but about what you share. Someone who lost everything, and found herself in the process. A hush fell over the crowd. The man's eyes met hers. Come forward. Her legs felt like lead as she stepped onto the stage. Applause erupted, but it wasn't the kind of applause she once craved. It wasn't for wealth. It wasn't for power. It was for who she had become. She took the microphone, swallowing hard. For a moment, she was speechless. The past year flashed before her, the hunger, the shame, the struggle, the lessons. And then, she smiled. A real smile. I used to think I was rich, she said. A few chuckles rippled through the crowd. She exhaled. But I wasn't. I had money, but I had nothing that mattered. Her voice grew stronger. Wealth isn't in numbers. It's in people. In kindness. In second chances. And in learning that sometimes, losing everything is the best thing that can happen to you. Silence. Then, thunderous applause. People stood. Some had tears in their eyes. And as she stepped back, the man in the dark suit gave her a single nod. Approval. Because she hadn't just passed the test. She had become something greater. Not rich in money. Rich in purpose. And that was worth more than anything she had ever owned.